North American streets are insanely dangerous. 100 Americans die every single day from traffic collisions, and despite people driving less during the pandemic, pedestrian fatalities spiked to the highest levels since the 1980s. When we try to address road safety, we usually say it's everyone's responsibility.
Pedestrian and motorists must respect each other's rights. There are several important safety rules that pedestrians must bear in mind.
And while this advice is not wrong, it's just not very helpful. Trying to improve road safety by changing people's behavior completely misunderstands why our streets are so dangerous in the first place. It fails to even comprehend the fundamental issues that lead to this problem. So why are American streets so dangerous, and what's the solution?
Most pedestrian fatalities are caused by the pedestrian's own negligence.
2 women struck while crossing a busy intersection.
Their safety is your responsibility.
To understand this problem, we need to first understand how a street is designed. This is the list of priorities when traffic engineers design a street. Their top priorities are speed and volume, while safety is second to last. The success of a road is measured using what's called level of service, which is basically how well traffic flows. It has an entire grading system where A means free-flowing traffic and F means complete gridlock. This means anything that can slow down traffic, which includes crosswalks or traffic calming measures, don't get implemented because it will affect the level of service. This is all very apparent when you look at streets in most of our cities. They're designed like highways, built to move as much vehicles as fast as possible, while safety is an afterthought.
Why don't you cross here?
You shouldn't run out between parked cars like you just did.
Baloney, watch this. Here I go.
There he goes.
Let's use the crosswalk.
This method of designing streets is completely backwards. A safe street is where vehicles move slowly, a place so busy that traffic can't easily get through. We should want streets like this. Streets that are so nice and safe that everyone's out enjoying it rather than speeding through in cars. Here lies the fundamental problem. The speed and convenience of vehicles are prioritized over the safety and lives of pedestrians. Traffic engineers will do anything to save a driver a few minutes of travel time at the cost of more and more lives. City streets are built like highways, prioritizing the flow of vehicles over safety and quality of life. But cities are places, not thoroughfares. People live, work, and shop and spend time here. Therefore, we need to make these places safe and inviting for people. You wouldn't build a house that's exclusively made up of hallways. Trying to rely on individual choices and personal responsibility to ensure road safety is counterproductive and completely disregards the systemic problems. Humans inherently aren't perfect, and we will make mistakes no matter what. So we can't fully depend on the decisions of individuals when we neglect the outside factors that lead to those decisions. We can't expect people to be safe when the system is fundamentally dangerous.
Children should be cautioned not to play in the streets. Last year, nearly 900 children were killed and several thousand injured.
A few years ago, my friend was hit by a distracted driver at this intersection, which by the way is right next to a high school. The driver blamed her for not being visible enough, even though this was during the day and she was in the middle of crossing. This idea that pedestrian safety is the sole responsibility of the person walking stems from auto industry propaganda in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, streets were public spaces that everyone could freely use. But as cars grew in popularity and became faster, more people started dying, particularly children. In fact, more Americans died from cars in the 4 years after World War I than from actually fighting in World War I. If the Germans couldn't kill the Americans with guns, they would do it with cars. But this undoubtedly caused a massive outrage, and by the 1920s, people hated cars. They demonized them and demanded speed governors to be installed onto them. But the auto industry fought back hard. Apart from lobbying the government and using their influence to create unfair laws, they deployed a massive propaganda campaign. The auto industry invented the term jaywalking to shame people who crossed the street anywhere they wanted.
Jaywalking is the most hazardous possible means of crossing. You are more than doubling your chances of being run down.
Keep in mind, this was completely normal back then. Streets were shared public spaces. In response to this, people also made the term J driving, but this didn't really catch on the same way. This had entirely flipped the conversation. If you got hit by a car, it was now your fault, even though it was the cars that made the streets dangerous in the first place. This mentality still persists today. When you go to any video showing a driver cutting someone off at a crosswalk or just flat out hitting them, many of the comments will be blaming the pedestrian. But jaywalking isn't and never was about safety. It was about getting people off the streets so that cars could drive faster. Our overemphasis on personal responsibility doesn't just affect pedestrians. Drunk driving and distracted driving can be largely attributed to our overdependence on cars.
The next few minutes, hours, or maybe days, their lives will hang in the balance. And you'll have to live out those minutes, hours, and days knowing you were responsible.
Many suburban bars and drinking establishments have huge parking lots and are located in places only reachable by car. It's dangerous to walk or bike, public transit is terrible, and they're located far away from where people live. When a place that sells alcohol is built like this, what do you expect? We don't want people to drink and drive, but at the same time we provide no viable options other than driving. Of course, there are options like Uber or Lyft, but ride-sharing apps literally only exist to make up for our lack of public transit. These private companies are not a sustainable solution, as they pose more of a danger to road safety and exploit their workers at the same time. Uber and Lyft only prove that providing alternatives to driving can reduce drunk driving. It shows that a huge part of this problem is because many people have no other option but to drive. The police, as well as organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, once again focus solely on personal responsibility, relying on safety campaigns and enforcement. And while these have had huge impacts, alcohol still contributes to 1/3 of all road fatalities. The next step we have to take is to disincentivize driving itself. We should be reducing our dependence on cars so people don't have to drive everywhere. This is essentially the same with distracted driving. If your mind is always wandering off or you're always on your phone, you're probably better off taking public transit. Not everyone is cut out to operate a vehicle for hours every day and remain focused at all times. But when there is no option other than driving, you're forced to do so even if you're tired, angry, or just not in the right state of mind. I've heard many cases where people fainted on the subway because they didn't eat breakfast or they didn't get enough sleep. So imagine those people were behind the wheel.
The Traffic Safety and Highway Improvement Department of Ford Motor Company recommends the Smith system. It keeps you from making mistakes and guards you from errors made by others.
If we actually want to improve road safety, we need to understand how design affects people's behavior and use that to our advantage. In the 1930s, automobiles were first being widely adopted, but the roads were not built for them. This led to an incredibly high rate of death, nearly 15 times more than today. But highway engineers realized that humans inherently aren't perfect and we will make mistakes. So instead of trying to change the behavior of drivers, we could instead redesign the road itself so that it forgives the mistakes that drivers make. So they made the lanes wider, smoothed out curves, and added clear zones to compensate for drivers' mistakes. This revolutionized highway safety all around the world, and road fatalities decreased steadily throughout the 20th century. So we know that design can make it safe to drive at high speeds. But the opposite is also true. By narrowing lanes, tightening curves, and removing clear zones, we can force drivers to slow down and make it safer for people outside a vehicle. This works because driving is mostly a subconscious activity. You're not constantly thinking about how fast you're going because no one has the mental capacity for that. So most of the time, drivers are simply going at a speed that feels comfortable. When you perceive a high amount of risk while driving, you will naturally slow down to avoid a collision. This is why arbitrarily changing the speed limit or putting up a new sign doesn't work. It does nothing to slow down drivers when the street is not designed to physically slow them down. North American cities still put way too much emphasis on enforcing rules and educating people. I'm not saying these aren't important, but there's simply not enough emphasis put on building raised crosswalks or reducing lanes. The Vancouver Police Department has an entire TikTok account where they catch people breaking petty rules and educate them on it, such as telling cyclists to come to a full stop at stop signs. While their intentions are positive, these videos are unproductive and they reinforce the myth that road safety is the sole responsibility of the individual, but you can't enforce your way out of bad design.
Most pedestrian fatalities are caused by the pedestrian's own negligence. Crossing in front of a bus from which you have just alighted is generally surefire for a ride in an ambulance.
Flashing crosswalk signals or pedestrian bridges attempt to improve pedestrian safety while inconveniencing drivers as little as possible. This is car infrastructure, not pedestrian infrastructure. There's also these corny highway slogans and signs warning drivers, but ironically, a driver needs to look away from the road to read these. Unsurprisingly, these do nothing but serve as a distraction, and studies have found that they can increase the number of crashes. Oh, and don't even get me started on these flags.
How do you think people know that you're crossing the street without the flag? They see you?
Road safety ultimately comes down to bad policies and design. Flashy signs, police enforcement, and public safety campaigns might have good intentions, but they put too much focus on individual choices rather than addressing the broader systemic issues. But here's the thing, even if you follow all the rules and do everything right, you can still be a victim of a crash. You personally might be a responsible, law-abiding citizen who always drives the speed limit or never drinks and drives, but all it takes is for someone else to break the rules and you'll still face the consequences. This is the paradox of a car-dependent system and relying solely on individual choices. The only way to reduce road fatalities is to make changes to our infrastructure and reduce our dependence on cars. Now, all of this has been about reducing road fatalities, but making our streets safer and nicer has far-reaching benefits on our health and our society. In the book The Blue Zones: Lessons for Living Longer from the People Who Live the Longest, the very first lesson is to be active without having to think about it. In other words, the people who live the longest don't have to be marathon runners or all-star athletes. They simply incorporate exercise into their daily lives, such as by riding a bike to work or walking to the grocery store. But these lifestyle choices are heavily dependent on the design of your built environment. Are your streets safe and comfortable to walk? Or are they hostile and dangerous? This is partly what allows Japanese people to live longer. Their narrow streets and walkable neighborhoods make it safe and comfortable to walk, even for the elderly. In the words of Enrique Peñalosa, God made us walking animals, pedestrians. As a fish needs to swim, a bird needs to fly, a deer to run, we need to walk, not in order to survive, but to be happy. Walking is a fundamental part of being human, so let's make it safer to do so.